Three contributions from opening government. The first is to explain what is a two-state solution and what does it mean to succeed. I'm secondly going to explain why it hasn't succeeded in the past. And thirdly, I'm going to explain what's different about the status quo and why that is the most important contribution in regards to a prediction in this debate. On what is a two-state solution with regard to Israel-Palestine. And note that I think a two-state solution just requires a two states to exist. And so we're going to take a very low burden in this debate. So the maintenance of the Palestinian Authority is a form of government which enables some form of self-actualization. Or perhaps the 15-point peace plan and oversight board, which has presently been appointed by the United States and agreed upon by most of the European heads of state. Some ability for Palestine to be recognized as a state, some ability for self-actualization. Note here that this is a low burden. We aren't suggesting a large degree of autonomy for Palestine as a state to operate, nor are we suggesting that the illegal settlements set up would be destroyed. We don't think those are realistic things. We also don't think it's necessary for a Palestinian state to exist. So then, why has this not succeeded in the past? And I'll take any clarifications if there are any. Okay, moving on. Why has this not succeeded in the past? Note here that we just have to prove that this, as a result of these factors may be changing, that,
What does success look like?
a success is just you get recognized, right? So the two states exist and then they are able to continue to exist. I think that's like a reasonable definition of the motion. So then, with regard to why this has not happened in the past and therefore success as a result of prediction. Firstly, there's been a lack of international pressure for it. Notably, the USA has protected Israel's interests and Europe has not exerted a large amount of pressure. This is for two reasons. With regard to the United States, there's a large Israel lobby within the United States, which means that the United States benefited largely from maintaining the status quo, which is why, for example, they vetoed many criticisms of illegal settlements within the West Bank. And with regard to Europe, especially leaders within Europe, like Germany, have usually wanted to protect Israel as a state for want of, sort of like not looking like they are neglecting the horrors of their past. So as a result, Israel's been able to act with large amounts of impunity. But secondly, Israel has benefited largely from destabilizing Palestinian state formation. Why? It's usually two reasons. Firstly, it's been helpful for them as a justification for greater hawkism and securitization of their state policy, i.e., if you make out Palestine to be a threat if they do become a state, then as a result, that justifies the continuation of, for example, the conservative government within the Knesset. But secondly, it's also a justification or has been used as a justification in the past for the annexation of land within the West Bank. So as a result, you've wanted to keep, for example, the Palestinian Authority from being able to object to that. The impact of that is that these mechanisms explain why the status quo has existed up until now. What has changed then? The first thing that has changed is a large degree of international pressure from the USA and Europe. With regard to Europe, and note here, with regard to Europe, the democratization of media and this very salience of this issue right now has meant that there's been a large degree of pressure from European leaders in order to act. And this empirically is manifested in, for example, many states like France and Canada recognizing the state of Palestine at the UN General Assembly. But note here that the first mover disadvantage of, for example, criticizing Israel, which is normally something that parties wouldn't need to do because they would be called anti-Semitic in European politics, has shifted because now the horrors of, for example, the Israel-Palestine war have become so obvious that there is no longer that first mover disadvantage, which means that it's become a centrist issue to, for example, recognize Palestine for wanting Israel to, for example, allow aid flow into Gaza and to give the Palestinian Authority some authority. With regard to the USA, Trump and populist presidents who will go after him into the future gain a lot from ending the conflict in order and recognizing Palestine and enabling a Palestinian state. And the reason why here is essentially because, firstly, you get the PR win of being seen as a change maker within the Middle East, which is something which is very hard to do, and something which is seen as a very normal, seen as a populist win in much of the United States. But secondly, the pro-Israel lobby, which previously would have benefited from, for example, making sure that Israel is able to act with impunity, has changed significantly. Firstly, Trump has changed the playbook with regard to how you interact with the Israel lobby, because rather than, for example, listening to them to all their concerns, the pro-Israel lobby has to notice the fact that Gaza is in ruins and that the Palestinian Authority is a reasonable alternative to Hamas, meaning that, for example, now the lobby is more incentivized to advocate against Hamas by using the Palestinian Authority and therefore a justification of statehood as a good proximate comparator. The second thing here is that the lobby's interests is not necessarily incongruent as much with Palestinian recognition because the settlements are largely already there. Gaza and the Hamas is already largely destroyed, meaning now the incentive in the long term is for the pro-Israel lobby and for Israel to lobby the United States in order to ensure peace and security for those settlements going forward, which means that there's large pressure to, for example, ensure stability within the Gazan region by setting up a board of international oversight, which is able to make sure that the Palestinians feel represented enough that they don't then elect Hamas, but also enough that, for example, Israel is able to maintain the settlements whilst ensuring a two-state solution under international law. But secondly, with regard to, and so as a result, this meant that there's a large amount of international pressure, which does have teeth because the ICC not threatening to not give Israel as much weapons for security, which they need in order to, for example, protect them from rockets from the Houthis, is a huge stick which they are able to leverage over. I'll take a POI from closing. Okay, moving on. Second point here, why there is less incentive for Israel to stand in the way of Palestinian statehood. With regard to Hamas, Hamas is now defeated, meaning you aren't able to justify as much the securitization and hawkism which previously would have enabled the Israel government to crack down on Palestine. But also, there's a large degree of need to focus your political capital on other issues. So, for example, the wars in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, which threaten the Israel government, meaning that, for example, there's a large incentive to settle this dead issue by, for example, creating a lukewarm Palestinian state, which is able to satisfy, for example, the demands of the ICC or the demands of Europe while still maintaining Israel's interests. Thirdly, there's an incentive to recognize Palestine now because you now get the first mover advantage of, for example, how the state will be set up, how to control the Palestinian Authority so it doesn't threaten Israel's interests, negotiate further settlement recognition in relation to the state of Palestine. Palestine is likely to support this, and the international community is likely to support this because, firstly, this is a large issue which European leaders gain a large benefit from dealing. Secondly, you create peace, which is in the interest of all these actors involved. But thirdly, you're likely to receive the backing from Europe, Arab states who would like ideological win here in the United States. This is a great future going forward. Proud to stand open in government.
Thanks for that speech, leader of op.
Yep, just give me 30 seconds. I'll be back.
Yeah, you need to start.
Yep. POS preferably from closing government. POS on chat, please. I'll take at least one POI's last clarification. Before that, I would like to give a couple of few shout outs. Firstly to Pranjal. Pranjal has been an amazing teammate throughout two majors that we planned to do, but one major that we actually done, and another major that we are going to do in a span of 2 months. Secondly, to Bia. Bia has been an amazing coach for us throughout the year. Thank you for all the learning that you have imparted. And more importantly, thank you for being a really, really good friend and a supportive friend at all points. Thirdly, just to IITB DepSoc. Yes. It's not enough to OG to skew away the burden, that it's enough for you to just recognize these two states from United Nations or from all countries. Because even if you recognize these states, you have to prove why there is solvency that is attached to this recognition. There needs to be some utilitarian metric that is attributed to gauge what is the metric for success of Israel-Palestine two-state solution in the first place. The first thing I'm going to do in my speech is just that. there are two reasons why peace and stability is the metric for success of Israel and Palestine two-state solution. The first thing is simply to say that the primary goal of any two-state solution, because I myself am from India, which is a victim of another two-state solution, is to avoid conflict or to ensure stability in the region, especially in the context of Israel and Palestine, when Jews all over the world came to this region because they were persecuted or because the government was just unsupportive to them and stuff like that. When they came to this region in the aftermath of World War II for a state of their own that was promised to them, the promise to both Jews, who will prospectively be Israelis, and the promise to also Palestinians who will be sharing the state with Israel, was that this will be mutually beneficial for both sides. Conflict and instability is a violation of this promise, upon which this goes against the end terminal value that was behind that promise, which was mutual benefit. Secondly, the alternative to two-state solution was just that Jews would have been wherever they were, be it like Russian Jews or German Jews or Poland Jews or Jews that were in US and whatnot. Which means whatever mechanism we give with respect to this context of Israel and Palestine in my speech or in Pranjal's speech is comparative, because the existence of Israel as a state as a consequence is a consequence of this two-state solution in itself. Which means if conflict and instability exist because of these two states being adjacent to each other, that means it's a violation of this promise in itself, which is the metric, which is what I'm going to prove. There are then 7 reasons due to which conflict and instability persists, and due to which this metric is something that is violated. The first thing is simply to posit that there are huge amounts of polarization that happens on both sides because of a couple of reasons. As for Israel, there are 3 reasons. Firstly, there's internal power consolidation incentive for politicians within Israel, provided that Israel is a democracy, provided that the nuance within how Israeli government works is that the current political spectrum or the historical political spectrum hasn't been right or left, but rather it has only been right or far right. Netanyahu happens to be on cross lines between right and moderate right and far right, at a point which far right people are pressurizing him or were pressurizing him in multiple instances to continue this war, where he was getting a lot of funding from and stuff like that. Even if this is not true, in order to consolidate people and to have a path of resistance, to have a vote bank, these people always keep these citizens of Israel distracted, and this is the easiest way out there in terms of instilling polarizable narratives, in terms of capitalizing on this in the first place. Secondly, the historical narrative that has always persisted within Israel and Jews is just the fact that our neighbors are always a threat to our existence. This is manifested by a couple of things, like extremist organizations that say Israel doesn't have a right to exist or all Jews should die, that are propped up in neighboring states that have persistent attacks within Israel, or just historical events or wars such as 6-Day War, where every Muslim Brotherhood country formed a coalition to just remove the state of Israel, to just occupy the state of Israel in the first place. All these are capitalized then by these politicians or internally right-wing, far-right factions, to create a narrative that we are always in a threat to existence, and that is exactly why we need to always be in a state of paranoia, or we need to always be the first ones to attack, we need to counter for us to exist in the first place. See, even if historical narratives are something that is out of the window for this debate, and only recent context is something that is considered, 7th October attacks were a huge trauma infliction on Israeli citizens, at upon which someone knew a neighbor or someone knew a person in their proximity that had their brother or sister that was affected by these attacks, or that more than 1,000 people were affected by these attacks. Even if this is not true, the intensity of hate that is instilled recently within Israel is something that is high, because this intensity of hate was something that's required by Israeli state apparatus for them to justify the continued genocide for so long. That is why even the protests that are persisting within Israel were effectively curtailed in the first place. All of this is why polarization exists in Israel. Why then polarization exists in Palestine? Firstly, there's a huge narrative on this is a religious violation, that they are capturing our holy sites, that they are systematically oppressing us whenever we are going to a holy site. This is a infliction of our right to religion and stuff like that. This is exactly why when people in Palestine or Muslims that are religious, this is something that that is a huge violation that they take very personally. Secondly, the occupation for so long and the trauma that is inflicted by systemic exploitation even before 7th October attacks is something that Israeli, like Palestinians, take so personally. And that is exactly why, like, the explanation for how Hamas is so powerful within Palestine is something that is explained because of like them being able to capitalize on this hatred that exists like for Israel. Thirdly, the trauma from genocide is something that is intuitive, which is so large, which is exactly why you will have a lot of hatred for Israel as well. All of this manifests into three things. Firstly, obviously the higher burden claim is some ground level like conflicts or instability happening means that it always has the potential to snowball, provided the intensity of hate that we have proved, which means the justification on both sides for a more radical action is something that is justified, which is exactly why conflicts are more abhorrent in these regions. So even if like 7th October like instances are not something that is frequent, this is exactly why you at least have extremist organizations that go ahead and constantly bomb Israel, or Israel that goes ahead and doing systemic oppression to these like Palestinians. At least one of this manifesting is a violation of the rhetoric or violation of the promise in itself. Thirdly, at least from time to time, people are exploited and people are deprived of the resources that they want to. Especially after this war, people's livelihood decreased significantly at a point which they were in the war, and a lot of people lost their livelihood and stuff like that. Why then guardrails of international guardrails don't work, but rather facilitate this war? Firstly, Iran has an active incentive to keep this like conflict alive because they have the incentive to complete the Shia crescent, for them to go ahead and like have a foothold in the region, for them to export oil and stuff like that. Secondly, at the point at which like they want Palestinians to be dependent upon them because they want to consolidate as much Muslim as much like Shia support as possible, provided that Saudi Arabia is in the other side of the bloc with US and also being a Sunni majority. And thirdly, Iran is a fundamentalist Islamist like autocracy, which means the imams and like the religious leaders that are proximate to the government always are justified in terms of going in and allocating state resources, which is easy because this is not a democracy and you always have no questions in terms of allocate whatever resources to pursue this war. US is isolationist, protectionist. Pranjal will prove the rest of this.
Thanks for that speech. Another reminder to speakers, it is incredibly important to take and offer POIs and take POIs when they're offered. It is almost criminal if you do not take a POI in a final. Having said that, DPM.
Three things in the speech. First, why Israel is likely to agree. Secondly, why Palestine will agree. And finally, why this two-state solution will be long-lasting and enduring into the future. But quickly, firstly, on what success means. I would note that as OG, we do have definitional fiat. And I think the definition that James gives is one that is reasonable, therefore one that should be respected across the debate, given, again, that we are OG. James explains that the metric for success is one where there is a recognition of statehood. It doesn't necessarily mean that Palestinians get a good deal or anything like that, but we think that even Palestinians would consider the recognition of statehood to be a success. They themselves want the ability to self-determine more than currently, and they also want to put an end to the violence. I think that that's clearly counts as a metric for success. But this speech will explain why I'll win on OO's metric as well. If they want us to be able to heavily limit conflict, I think a written solution is the biggest way that you're likely to limit conflict. I think their side is not very comparative if you care about that as a metric for success. Firstly, on why Israel is likely to agree. OO's first claim here is that this is not in the interest of the Israeli government because they believe that they have a right to this land. They believe, that this was promised to them, etc., etc. I think that this is a very homogenous way to view a group of people with extremely diverse views on this topic. What actually matters in terms of predicting how Israel will act is not the individual opinions of any one Jewish person who lives in Israel, but is instead the way that the government operates and who's likely to be in power. Why is it likely that Netanyahu is going to be voted out in favor of a pro-two-state solution prime minister who will broker this deal and ensure that it's one that is stable? Firstly, his approval ratings are in the toilet. Many Israelis blame Netanyahu's long tenure and divisive politics for ruining national cohesion, for undermining intelligence, and and for indirectly enabling Hamas's rise. A post-war reckoning is extremely likely. It mirrors the ones after other wars that have happened, like the Yom Kippur Wars, where the initial leadership that created a lot of that instability was ousted. Many Israeli people have been stuck in bunkers over the last 2 years because their homes are being bombed because of Netanyahu's actions. I think people are unlikely to forget that and are likely to vote them out. The second thing to say, though, is that there's likely to be fracturing of Netanyahu's right-wing coalition. That's for the reason that Netanyahu has never really had a majority and has relied on the support of other far-right or other religious nationalist parties. But as domestic crises worsen, moderate Likud members, other centrist factions are obviously less likely to continue supporting them when it is causing Israel harm in other ways. And that links into the third reason around international pressure as well. Because as long as the US and EU remain deeply committed to a two-state vision, which I think James gives excellent analysis to explain that they are likely to absolutely no response from this allo speaker, Israel depends on that Western diplomatic and monetary support and military support as well. The US can do things like condition future like aid or deals or things like that on this two-state solution. That is likely to push Israeli elites to adopt a more cooperative line, given that they want to still enjoy a cushy life, given that they still want to enjoy the protections of the US and want to go there and send their kids to university there and all of those sorts of things, which is a likely reason why they're also likely to conform and fall in line. The pushback the only other, I guess, actual piece of analysis that we hear from the leader of opposition is the idea that Israeli individuals are going to feel that they need to exterminate Palestine because they feel like they know someone who was affected by the October 7th attacks. They were so disgusted by it and things like that. I think the first question to ask is for the large number of moderate Israelis that do exist. It is unclear why exterminating a large portion of the existing population was not enough of a response for these individuals. Yes, it is true there's a small number of extremely far right-wing voices there, but I think James already explains to you and concedes, we concede that this deal isn't necessarily going to be a good one for Palestinians. It's not necessarily going to give them all of their land back in the best way, in the most awesome way that they want. But that is the very reason that Israel's likely to be okay with that, likely to feel like this is a win and unlikely to push back on that there. All of that should explain to you that Israel is very likely to accept this deal. James gives you a number of other reasons that were unresponded to about why the US is likely to pressure them and force them to accept this deal. But importantly, why in the short to medium term, the people in power in Israel will be supportive of this deal, as well. I'll take CO if you've got a point.
So who exactly does Israel negotiate with to get the approval or recognition for the two-state solution? Is it with Palestine, with Hamas, West Bank, East Bank?
I think as I'll go on to explain, the existing peace deal has been brokered by a number of different countries. So you've got the US, you've got Trump heading that current Gaza peace deal. They're negotiating with representatives of Palestine. They're also negotiating with other countries like Egypt and Turkey as well to ensure accountability. I'll explain that in the final point. Second point on why there won't be flare-up from the Palestinian side. I think very obviously they have very depleted resources and human capital, which means in the short to medium term, they just will not be able to mount an opposition, especially not an opposition one where they, on a rational calculus, will be able to win in any way. They have suffered such extreme devastation. I don't think that there's any explanation for why they're likely to risk more lives, risk more devastation, given that there is no reasonable chance that they will be able to win anything back. Secondly, though, the signing of the Abraham Accords and the normalization of Israel amongst several Arab countries for which they receive all of their support, places like Egypt and Turkey, means that Egypt and Turkey are not necessarily supporting their pushback either. OO says that Iran will meddle and that will be really bad. But Iran gives an extremely small amount of support to Palestine compared to the large amount of support that is given by other Arab states that have signed on to the Abraham Accords and do implicitly support Israel or support a two-state solution, which explains to you why that's a far larger and far more proximate influence on Palestine. I don't understand why Iran is able to outweigh all of the money and all of the other support that they get from those other places as well. Lastly, they say, well, they hate Israel for the genocide that's been happened. Obviously, that's a very unnuanced way of viewing the world. Japan's committed a lot of genocides in Korea and stuff like that, but they still coexist and trade. There's been genocides all over the world where countries still coexist and trade. I think that's a very unnuanced way of viewing what people most want, which is life, liberty, and all of those things. They can't get that if they're still fighting. Finally, why a two-state solution will be long-lasting. Firstly, a large number of eyes are on Gaza right now, and that means that any deal that is signed is likely to be extremely comprehensive. That's demonstrated by the existing peace deal that is literally 20 points long. It involves Israel retreating their forces and all of those sorts of things. But more importantly, it involves an accountable task force, including representatives from the US, from Qatar, from Egypt, from Turkey, from all of these other countries that will actually monitor the implementation and ensure this is lasting into the long term. The reason why this is really, really important is because it's in Israel's incentive to appease Palestine in order to avoid the creation of another Hamas as well. It's in everyone's interest. Obviously, this is the most likely thing to happen. Extremely proud to be an OG.
Thanks for that speech. TLO to conclude top half.
Hi, can I be clearly heard?
Yeah.
Cool. A few shout outs, Vishwa, for putting up with all the stuff that I've put him through, starting from like not missing check-ins for a competition, delaying my flights to ABP, putting him through a lot of stress. He's put up with that. He's supported me brilliantly in like difficult times. I'm very grateful for that. Secondly, Via obviously is a fantastic coach. A lot of the success is owed to her. Thirdly, IITB RepSoc and like the debating community in general. I am very, very grateful that you people exist and I can call you my friends. And this is a community that I can be part of. Lastly, to my junior Rogers, to whom I promised that I'll say a certain thing in the shout outs if I reach finals, but I cannot say that it's too inappropriate. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Kashmir is literally a cold desert where you literally have no resources, where you literally have nothing to fight over. Similarly, Palestine is not particularly good territory, or it is largely desert. It cannot be cultivated. It does not have a lot of mineral wealth, etc. The reason why OG loses this debate is because they feel that people evaluate this conflict in utilitarian terms. People think that the reason why they should pursue this conflict is because they have some utilitarian benefit to gain out of it. That is not the case. I'll revert the utilitarian claims as well, but the primary reason why people fight these conflicts is because of emotion. It's because of things like honor. It's because of things like religious duty. India does not fight with Pakistan over Kashmir because it really wants to protect Kashmir, and Kashmir is very valuable territory. Fight with over Kashmir because Pakistan's advances on Kashmir is a middle finger to like India's authority as a state. Similarly, Palestine's in that region is a middle finger to the authority of the Israel state, to the dreams that the Jewish people have of having a protected homeland where they are protected from the persecution that they have historically suffered all over Europe and all around the world. And even though they're just occupying a small sliver of land in this particular place, surrounded by like Arab enemies, they're still not allowed to have that one piece of land, and so much conflict has happened over that. In that case, this is something that becomes personal. This is something that people become willing on certain utilitarian harms to still pursue, at which point this is something that is a matter of honor, matter of pride, matter of religious duty. Why then do their utilitarian benefits not necessarily work? Their claims are that people are tired of conflict and people necessarily want peace. The problem with this claim is that this is largely uncomparative. This is something that has been true for a long time previously. At the point at which people forever, presumably, have wanted things like able to send the children to schools or to be able to like not live in bunkers, etc. It probably meant that if this was the primary motivation of people, people probably would have ceased conflict immediately or like long ago. At the point at which this conflict has still continued means that people have priorities above that. But secondly, at the point at which there is so much hatred brewing on the surface, even if it is not utility-wise something that is very, very useful, at the very least, this is very, very potent as political rhetoric, as Vishwa explains to you. It is very easy for an opposition party that is trying to disrupt status quo to point out the fact that there is like as much effort to take over Palestine and then keep on harping about how much harm Palestine has caused, how much bloodshed has happened, and if after all that bloodshed, the current administration has just given Palestine over, making all of those sacrifices worth nothing, making all of those lives lost worth nothing, all of the hostages that suffered day after day in like tunnels in Gaza, all of their suffering came worth nothing. At that point, people probably get largely polarized as a result of this when they're fed this rhetoric to a large extent, which means they are necessarily they're necessarily like a stoop of gunpowder waiting to ignite. This is particularly more true for things like Palestine because of a few reasons. One, at the point at which you can probably, let's say, replace Hamas with like PLO, etc., you still have Hamas existing in to some extent or the other. At the point at which there are a large number of radicalized people, all of whom Israel has not managed to kill, that still exist in that state and cannot be simply taken off the face of the earth. It probably still means that Hamas exists as a threat, which means then relationships then further sour with when it comes to the inability of like the Palestine PLO to control Hamas. Even if Hamas makes a small attack that does not require a lot of resources, that does not require you to be like very, very strong, even if they make a guerrilla attack, even if they cross the border once and kill a small number of people, this is something that ignites these negative sentiments that are brewing under the surface in people's minds. But secondly, in terms of like leaders within Palestine, they have even more of an incentive, given the history of instability and the ability to capture power based on this issue, to go ahead and radicalize these people. And these people have every reason to be radicalized because you cannot offer them much in the alternative. Like, as per OG's own concession, probably Palestine does not have a lot of resources at the point at which this happened. They're probably a very poor state. They do not have many material luxuries. In a situation like this, what people hold on to is ideology. What people hold on to is their feeling of honor and their feeling that they're defending their faith and they're defending their homeland and that they're doing what is just, even if they're poor, they're at least on the right side of things. At that point, you're probably like able to motivate people a lot by bringing back the memories of things such as like the massacres that happened, all the children that died, all the atrocities that happened. This is not dependent on the current government being in power or the next government coming in to be this. Even if like by some miracle in the short run this solution works, the solution is likely to break down. Finally, why stability is a metric? Obviously, like this is something that is called a solution. A solution exists to a problem, and a solution is successful and it solves the problem. The reason why the two-state solution exists is specifically to solve the problem of the conflicts that have happened. Before I move on to rebutting international influence, I'll take a POI from closing.
Can you name a solution that you think would solve this problem?
I do not have the burden to do that. At the point at which the solution wouldn't work out enough for us to win this debate, we'll simply prove that. Why then does international influence not work? Their mechanism is that all countries anyway have the incentive to go ahead and help like solve this problem. The only reason they do not do so is optics, because maybe like you get called anti-Semitic for like standing up against Israel, or like or like Islamophobic at the point at which you stand up to Arab. But they themselves highlight several incentives for countries to actually help these people out. All the people in the Israeli lobby do not disappear in America. All the politicians that are sympathetic to Israel do not disappear. The military-industrial complex, it makes a lot of money off of this conflict at the point at which all the aid that goes to Israel necessarily has to be spent in buying arms from the United States, etc., does not go away. In which case, it is very, very unclear why necessarily, just because there's some sentiment building right now, these tangible and long-term incentives to keep this conflict going on or to not settle continues. But even if there's sentiment to go ahead and do this, we think the Western powers do not have the capacity to do this at the point at which they are becoming largely isolationist. Most people in America generally do not care about this conflict. There are few people on college campuses and highly liberal hotspots that probably care about what's happening in Israel and Palestine, but a vast majority of people in America care about things like prices of groceries, the prices of the eggs they eat. At that point, they probably do not want the government to do things like this. And at the point at which you probably also have economic problems incoming, given all the tariffs, etc., that you have implemented, it probably means that you are not able to money into this, or people are fairly antagonized when you go ahead and indulge in things like this. But lastly, in terms of Israel not having enemies, we think this is largely untrue. Things like the 6-day border, etc., were fought by like a large number of Arab states against them. We think like Israel still continued their hold over Palestine. For all of those reasons, very proud to oppose.
Thanks for that speech. That concludes top half of the debate. Inviting member of Gov to start back half.
I want to begin this speech with two observations about the debate so far. Firstly, on opening government setup, clearly illegitimate for two reasons. Firstly, at the moment, the conditions they identify have already been met. 2 states exist, 157 states recognize Palestine, and they have some autonomy. But secondly, even if you don't believe that is true, it was certainly true pre-war when they had far more autonomy than they do now. The 2 states still existed and 110 countries recognized Palestine. You cannot have a truistic definition that is already met. They have to defend something changing. But secondly, even if you think their definition is legitimate, we will take a far higher burden, and you should give us the debate, not opening government the debate, for the reason that we will better prove the argument that it will succeed. We will demonstrate an end to the conflict, two recognized autonomous and sovereign states, a real two-state solution occurring and succeeding. The second observation we'll make in this debate is that there is no timescale for when this must happen. We don't need to prove it happens this year or this decade. We just need to prove it will happen eventually. That is precisely what top half misses. In the long run, the only stable equilibrium to this conflict is a two-state solution, which is precisely why it is inevitable. And that is how CG will win the debate. We're going to prove two things at closing government. Firstly, once attempted, a two-state solution will succeed. And secondly, that a two-state solution will be attempted. Let's start with that first claim. Why is it that if tried, a two-state solution will succeed? There are 5 reasons for this claim. The first reason is just, I would just observe that the vast majority of diplomats and experts, Palestinian and Israeli, around the world agree that the only way to solve the conflict is a two-state solution, which is precisely why it is a solution that has been proposed time and time again, precisely why the Oslo Accords were negotiated and the Camp David Accords occurred. The second reason, though, is we'd note that it is in the incentives of the Palestinians. That is to say, the motivating narrative for the conflict on the Palestinian side is that they have nothing to lose. They've been denied their land, they've been denied self-governance, and they've been forced into poverty by Israeli control of their borders, by their airspace, by their trade, and even internal movement within, for example, the West Bank. And that means that there is no point attempting peace because they have nothing to gain from it. The only thing that they can do is fight Israel and hope to gain something in that way. But notably, a two-state solution changes that dynamic because it gives them a state, which means that they do have something to lose and they have so much to gain by engaging in peace. Things like the chance to rebuild, things like economic development, things like the chance to live meaningful lives. But secondly, thirdly, it is in Israel's incentives. That is to say that a two-state solution would afford Israel the benefit of peace, the ability to finally feel safe, and an end to the costs of ongoing conflict. Thousands of soldiers who have died over countless wars, thousands of civilians who've died, the military costs of maintaining one of the largest economies, forcing people into conscription, and foregoing large quantities of economic growth. And yes, maybe there are some people who care really much about controlling the entire Holy Land, who believe the war could be won, but they will not win out over the people who want to be richer, who want to be who want their loved ones to survive, and who want an end to these hostilities and the prospect of a much better life. But fourthly, because the cost of sabotaging this agreement once it is commenced will be intensely high. That is to say, the interests of most international actors around the world are to see a two-state solution succeed, and an attempt by either party to, for example, buck that trend or end the two-state solution would be met with massive crippling sanctions, if not international response. That is to say, Israel's attempts to end that two-state solution would be seen by the Western public as a betrayal, as it would by the vast majority of Muslims who live around the world, and those countries would engage in crippling sanctions and an end to military aid for Israel that would force it to come to heel. Similarly, Palestine obviously has a large number of powerful champions around the to the extent that Palestine were the one to betray the deal, obviously a very large Jewish diaspora around the world would bring to bear a large amount of force against it, particularly because there'd be no justification for beginning a conflict once the two-state process has begun. But finally, we would note that as time passes, it becomes harder to go back. Tensions fade, just as they have in Rwanda or Northern Ireland. Radicalization ends because you no longer have the need for radicalization when there are prospects to go to school, to start a life, to get a job. But finally, trade and relationships between the two countries forges bonds that are hard to break. The impact is, if tried, this solution would definitely work. Second thing we'll prove then is why a serious attempt will occur at establishing a two-state solution. And there are 3 reasons for this. The first one is just that the consensus of most experts around the world is that this is what should be attempted. Anytime there is an attempt to negotiate peace in the Middle East, the two-state solution is precisely what comes up, which is why the Camp David Accords and the Oslo Accords were attempted. We think if any of those processes reach their conclusion, that will necessarily work, which is precisely why it is what people will push for. Secondly, though, we would notice the only stable equilibrium in the Middle East. Short of one side just wiping out the other side, there is no other end to the war. The conflict will just continue. And we would note that obviously it is relatively unlikely that one party would be able to wipe the other out. Which is to say, look at the backlash that Israel has gotten to producing, say, 50,000 Palestinian deaths. If they were to attempt to kill 5 million, obviously people would be far more upset. There would be military and economic response. And similarly, think about how upset people were about October 7th. The alternative required here would be far, far worse on orders of magnitude. We would say that after a sufficient amount of conflict, people will agree to try peace, just as they have in Rwanda and Northern Ireland. The final reason is we would just say the alternatives to attempting the two-state solution have been discredited. Before that, though, I'll take opening opposition.
Things like international pressure, disapproval of the things that have been happening have existed for a long time. Why hasn't the two-state solution worked yet?
Well, one, the two-state solution hasn't been tried, so that's not a reason why, if it is tried, it will not work. Secondly, as to why it has not been tried, we would point out, one, that often it takes time for these things to occur, which is why notably the fact that we are not limited on the timescale of when this resolution must occur is important. But secondly, for the reasons I will just describe now in the final part of this extension, that the alternatives were not discredited in the past, but now have been. That is to say that Bibi survived in Israeli politics for about 25 years by telling people they could have their cake and eat it too. We could continue to expand Israeli settlements by engaging with Hamas and failing to engage with the Palestinian Authority. And in empowering Hamas, we would be able to kind of discredit the peace process, weaken the PA, and therefore get everything that we want. But October 7th clearly discredited that because it showed that the consequence of empowering groups like Hamas is October 7th, is conflict. And it's told them that that is not something they should try again. But similarly, the aftermath of the war in Gaza has taught many Palestinians that armed conflict and armed resistance is often in many ways not a desirable pathway, that joining these groups isn't the way, that engagement with groups like the PA and a peace process is in fact desirable. We think precisely for that reason, far more groups are likely to believe in the future that the two-state solution is what is going to work. At the end of this debate, what you should believe is that there is only one stable equilibrium for the Middle East. It is a two-state solution, and it is inevitable.
Thanks for that speech, member of OP.
Hello, can I be seen and heard?
Yeah.
Okay. Give me a sec to organize my notes. There are a lot of them. Okay. CG is historically ignorant. The two-state solution has been tried before. It was rejected by Hamas and it was sabotaged by Israel. And our argument is that if we was tried again, the exact same thing would happen. Firstly, on the metric of this debate, OG concedes that what they want is for two states to exist. But what they fail to realize that they are conceding is that the definition of a state to be recognized by the UN and to be recognized internationally, both by political scientists and by politicians, is an incredibly stringent one. It means that you must have your own land. It means you have your own sovereignty. You have your own population. You have a monopoly of violence within your borders, and you have your own government, none of which they prove. We will explain why even if one of those conditions of being called a state fail, it means that we take out all of GovBench because this is the criteria that they have bound themselves to by OG's definitional fiat. The first argument I will make is that there is a process argument, which is that the process of peace is fragile and tenuous, that it relies on a perfect sequence of events and that the chance of success is very low. If I successfully prove this to you, you should believe two things. Firstly, that is extremely unlikely, but secondly, it will demonstrate how easy it is for any small radical group to sabotage the peace process, which lowers the bar substantially for the opposition bench to win the debate. Why is the process incredibly fragile and tenuous? Three reasons. Firstly, because the two-state solution requires prolonged negotiation, it requires coordination, and it requires diplomacy, which has never happened before. And there is no precedent for these kinds of things to exist. The preemption from opening government is that, this will be mediated by other actors. But this misses the core of the clash, which is that you must get the Israeli government and a reputable organization from Palestine, be it the PA or Hamas, to sit down to you and agree to a peace deal, which is incredibly unlikely. There are multiple moving parts and coordination that is required for this solution to work. And to do this and to prove this, I just want to observe what a two-state solution is likely to look like. It means that you must move settlers out of your territory because you must have complete monopoly of violence and sovereignty over your territory, which I will note is incredibly difficult because of how aggressive Israel has been in settler colonialism. It involves the disarmament of Hamas, which Hamas is actively defying. Now that the Israeli troops have withdrawn to the borders of Gaza, these individuals are popping up within the sector again, and they are fully armed. They're intimidating civilians. It involves things like Israeli retreat and laying down your arms. It relies on things like securing the borders and the full release of hostages. These are all multiple moving parts that must all happen sequentially for a prolonged long period of time for this to happen. And this is where the analysis for opening government works against them. Because if they want to have multiple peacekeeping organizations and multiple watchdogs from multiple different countries to come down and monitor this lengthens the process dramatically. It means that there are so many more checks and balances. There are so many more potential avenues for which this thing can be sabotaged. What if one of these peacekeeper organizations gets attacked by a rogue Hamas sect? What happens if the Israeli military accidentally fires off a few more missiles? These are all things that can potentially happen that will derail the peace process. Secondly, there's a psychological bias due to conflict. Opening opposition is closed. They say that people are polarized, but this is not the correct word. People are radicalized, and they are radicalized by the process of conflict. After acts of war, like, for example, the bombing from Iran, the bombing from Hezbollah, the trauma of the October 7th attacks, people are afraid. People are afraid because this conflict came out of the blue. It threatened their normal lives. All of a sudden, they were threatened online because of their national identity. They were forced to choose a side between individuals that were protesting on the streets against the genocide and against individuals who thought that being able to clamp down on Hamas was incredibly important for national security. The sense of normalcy that these individuals had within Israel were actively crumbling, which meant that it was very easy for these individuals to be swept up within the nationalist fervor of other political actors that had malicious intent. Opening opposition concedes this. They say that individuals are tired of war because they are living in bomb shelters, so they want to end the war. This is correct, but this will not play out in the way in which they say, because the way you want to end the war is to ensure that you have peace forever, and the only way for you to do this is to place Palestine back under the authoritarian arm of the Israeli military, returning to the status quo that emerged before the October 7th attacks. The final mechanism is just that it is not in the short-term interest of actors to do this. Hamas see themselves as freedom fighters, and they rule through violence, which means that when the US peace plan required these individuals to lay down their arms in order to restore legitimacy, this is not what they did. They emerged with their arms. They went back to trying to reassert control within the sect because it made them feel powerful and because it framed them as freedom fighters. The Likud party and Netanyahu specifically will not want to do this because they know that their hold on power is tenuous, because they know that if they stand down now, they may never be able to secure political legitimacy again. Netanyahu in particular, it has a particular incentive to do this. There's a 63-page corruption indictment upon him because he received thousands of dollars in bribery funds. The Zionist parties do not want this because they're ideologically tied towards the ability to raise Palestine, and the ultra-orthodox or the ultra-Orthodox or Haredim sect within Israel do not want this either. This is 13% of the population, and these are individuals who actively support this kind of thing simply because, for a very trivial reason, that settler colonialism lowers the prices for these individuals. So it means that you're able to live within Palestine occupied territory and actualize their vision of the good life. So all of these individuals have no incentive to allow this peace process to continue. I'll take opening.
Yeah, so we gave pretty extensive reasoning as to why a moderate pro-two-state solution Israeli government is likely to be in power, why the elites that you talk about are likely to want this as well. Why is that not all upstream of all of Israel's behavior that you assert?
I will now weigh this analysis. It is important for this to succeed within the short term because your window of opportunity is closing. The only reason why this two-state solution has been pushed through is because of the visceral and horror and entrenched horror that individuals have seen in Gaza. The news cycle moves quickly. There are other conflicts, there are other horrors. Think about things like Yemen, think about things like other conflicts within the world, for example. And world leaders actively do not want this. They're only doing this because it allows them to have a great deal of political capital and because they cave to public pressure, which means that insofar as there's a temporary lapse in fighting and this no longer is at the top of the political agenda, these individuals will no longer do this. Finally, I will complete the argument by explaining why it's the case that this peace is fragile and why it's easily broken. Firstly, there are perverse incentives from these short-term individuals to, these individuals have short-term incentives to sabotage the process, which means that they will do things like escalation because it means that they will get interests for themselves. These interests are material because they want to have the land to colonize. It's ideology because they believe that Palestine is rightfully theirs, or it's religious, which means that these individuals are all actively looking for a justification to reignite the conflict. Lastly, I'll explain why it's the case that radical individuals will emerge and actively fight this. And this is just very simple. The process of war has radicalized individuals. There are radical sects on either side of the house. And in order for these individuals who realize that their window of opportunity is closing, these individuals will react with violence and with radicalism. They will shoot UN peacekeepers. They will attack individuals on the ground. They will try to sabotage the attacks. And when that happens, when that inevitably happens, this sends us back upon the spiral of escalation that led us to this situation in the first place. The last thing I would note to deal with CG directly is that all of the analysis I explained is structural. AIPAC has co-opted 50% of American politicians. All of these things point to a fractured Israeli society, which explains why all of these mechanisms extend into the long run as well.
Thanks for that speech, GovVip.
I audible and everything?
Yeah, can you maybe say something again? You're a bit faint.
Yeah. Sorry, am
Yeah,
I audible? Awesome. Wait, I can turn up my volume. Let me fix that. Yeah, there we go. Much better. Awesome. Do POIs have you like? I want to begin this speech by explaining closing government's theory of the case, which is that this topic is not worded, this House predicts that this two-state solution will work, or this House predicts that any other two-state solution will work. It is this House predicts that a two-state solution will succeed. That is, when this conflict ends, what will have solved the conflict? What will have replaced this state of endless war, the state of endless instability, with something that can last? And our case involves two very simple contentions. One, it is impossible for any other stable solution to this conflict to emerge. Second, a two-state solution can succeed. Not that a two-state solution necessarily will succeed, that if you start trying it, it will always work, but merely that this is a solution that can succeed. Because what believing those two premises means is that every time any other solution fails, and they go back into war, and there is more conflict and more death, and they try again, eventually this one will work and no other one will. So in the long run, what we explain is that ours is the side that will end up winning. In the long run, the only alternative to constant and eternal war, which is of course implausible and impossible, is that this solution emerges. So we'll explain two things there. First thing is that nothing else can succeed. No other team in the debate even deigns to question this argument. We explain that no other alternative would be stable. They would involve the necessary genocide of one or the other of the sides, or for whichever side that ends up on top, dismantling its own system. Because the Israeli state conceives of itself as an entity that is Jewish, as an entity whose raison d'etre is the preservation of the Jewish state. It will never accept a solution where it incorporates into a one state all of the Palestinians who would outvote it, who would, for all of the reasons described by the opposition teams in this debate, probably not like that state. And we secondly explain that every other alternative in this debate is discredited. And CEO says, oh, well, you've tried this one before. But in fact, it hadn't been tried. There was a serious attempt made at the Oslo Accords, which failed because the Prime Minister of Israel that tried the Oslo Accords was assassinated. Yitzhak Rabin was killed. No serious attempt has been made to assassinate this. What is the implication of believing that no other solution can succeed? Firstly, it explains that the arguments advanced by the other teams in this debate are just not very compelling, because those arguments are made about right now. Even closing opposition, who say their arguments are structural, don't in fact make structural arguments. The vast majority of them are like, Hamas currently controlled the area, Likud currently has this position, like Netanyahu's scared about this court case. Those arguments might be true right now, but they are not true for the vast majority of time. They will not be true into perpetuity. We explain this process will keep happening into perpetuity until something ends it, and this is likely to end it. But secondly, it overcomes the quibbles made by closing opposition about the process. Because closing opposition say, well, in order for your argument to work, closing government, you need to get to the point that Israel and Palestine have demilitarized and withdrawn and let each other live. And yes, that is obviously a difficult thing, but no other thing will ever stop war, which means that eventually that thing will be tried. Eventually, in the arc of history, this is a solution that can work. So we've explained that nothing else will work, so they will always end up trying a two-state solution. Why, therefore, is it possible that a two-state solution will succeed? Udai explains 5 reasons, none of which received any response from that government speech. What does he explain? Firstly, that it is once Palestine is its own independent state, that the incentives of Palestinians shift towards maintaining that state because now they have something to lose. Now they have security to land. Now, for instance, everyday Palestinians do not believe that every day the Zionist entity exists, they will have their homes taken away because settlements continue to expand. There is some security that suggests they should demilitarize. Second, because the state of constant war is unproductive for Israel. It is sad for Israel. It is demoralizing for Israel. It means that their daughters and sons are killed. That state of war is one that eventually they would like to stop. Thirdly, because anyone who tries to sabotage this, and note this pre-response the entire closing opposition case, anyone who tries to sabotage it will be annihilated by the rest of the world, because that world cares so deeply about attempting this to occur. Fourthly, that as time passes, it will heal the wounds described by the other teams in the debate. Fifthly, that the existence of two independent states bonds them to each other. They build relationships. They have contact theory that is meaningful rather than just contact theory that is in war. And I want to compare this to opening government in 2 senses. First, opening government's definition of success is, I think, one that is just untenable in this debate because it is a truism. That is, opening government define a definition that is true right now is obviously impermissible in a This House Predicts motion to predict something that is true right now, because otherwise you'd automatically win. So of course that definition must be rejected. But secondly, all of OO's mecs are specific to the world right now. Our mechanisms are specific to the world as it is likely to continue into the future. Let's first respond to opening opposition then. Opening opposition say, basically, there's a bunch of sensations and feelings that mean people hate each other that will never fade. There are three problems with this argument. Firstly, we explain that in the long run, these sensations are likely to fade. And oftentimes, this is likely to be very tragic, right? Like, for instance, it's probably that people who are Palestinian, who have been displaced from land that will end up in the Israeli state, currently remember that displacement because they were the ones that were kicked out. But over time, it will not be them that was kicked out, but their grandparents and then their great-grandparents who were kicked out. So over the long run of history, those feelings of anger will fade. Secondly, at best, what OO prove is that it will not succeed, but that people will hate each other while living in separate states. And it is in fact totally fine for people to hate each other while living in separate states, for three reasons. Firstly, they can discharge that hate in ways that do not involve them going to war. It can be, for example, in doing things like sanctioning each other or not cooperating with each other or being rude with each other in the same way that India and Pakistan do that all the time without going to full-scale war at all the time. Secondly, they can discharge that hatred individually. They can be racist. They can dislike each other. That doesn't mean that states are going to go to war. But thirdly, the hatred that people feel is not hatred that the government is likely to feel. And that hatred the government is likely to feel is likely to be mitigated by all of the pressures that we describe it being placed under. Opening opposition.
Is the hatred between Israeli and Palestinian people more now compared to, let's say, 1948 or less?
Of course not. Sorry, mate, what are you on about? In 1948, a bunch of Palestinians had been displaced and exiled, and like almost all of Palestinians being kicked out of their land. Today, of course, Palestinians are extremely angry because another war has occurred. But what we explain is that once you set up a state, many of those people will live in more normal lives in ways that allow them to experience meaningful senses of justice. Third reason that OO is wrong is simply that their practical arguments, things like Iran fighting against it, in fact explain why we'll succeed, because Iran is unpopular, it is weak and getting weaker, and that explains why we'll end up on our side. Finally, let's respond to CO. Firstly, so many of their mechs are derivative. Like, just check your notes. Like, they just rip off OO unbelievably strongly. But secondly, their claim on the process relying on trust is rebutted by our case. Because we explain, firstly, that the interests of these actors is overwhelmingly to support peace, which is why they would not allow anyone inside their party, any individual faction or group, to disrupt that peace process. And where some rando did disrupt the peace process, of course, they would not use that to end the war. They would try instead to keep peace going. But secondly, all of the things that they describe, things like violence, things like the desire for long-term security, do not take account of the fact that the situation in which you are likely to be attempting this process is after a war. That is when people are at their most tired, at their most demoralized, at their least willing to try and go for maximum victory and instead go for a victory that can be achieved. And if there's anything that closing government has shown, it is that this is a victory that can be achieved. Very, very proud to govern.
Thanks. So that speech op whip to conclude the debate.
So OG gave you a set of reasons as to why some people would like to see the two-state solution happen, or give you a host of reasons as to why some people would not want to see that happen. And then you're left holding the bag, trying to weigh up which teams argue a bit better. The unique contribution come out from Lit 1 was that he told you explicitly, unless for some reason, OG decisively beat out all of the reasons from OO, I don't think just simply proving that there's some reasons or some incentive for peace automatically means that you can prove that the peace process will materialize, because that's something that takes a process to approach, which means that the burden on government bench is to prove that there are in fact structural infrastructure for that peace arrangement to be made. Insofar as that's absent, I think it's fair for us to claim that those infrastructures are absent, even if it's the case that there is very strong support towards peace, if it's the case that the infrastructure does not materialize for peace to be achieved, for recognition to be given mutually from both these states, likely then the two-state solution would fail. The empirical proof of this is that it has been done in the past. Even if it's the case that someone shot the president or whoever was in Oslo to try to, propose this plan, that is a sign of the fact that it didn't work, because there's just so many things that things can go wrong. Additionally, like Israel previously supported the two-state solution. They had like proposed a realignment plan in 2008 by that Prime Minister. They have now retracted from that. My point here is just proving that many people support the plan is insufficient to prove that the plan would materialize in terms of success. The reason for that is because there are people that do not want the plan to succeed. Insofar as they have a mechanism or capacity to derail that plan, I think the debate falls to closing opposition. Why is it the case then that the existing prerequisite for you to get to the two-state solution to materialize is absent? The first thing that Lewin told you is that there's just a clear direction in terms of dialogue, and this is also flagged out to by the POI to OG. So if it's the case that I ask for POI from, if I accept a POI from OG, I would like them to clarify it. Like at this point of time, who is Israel supposed to negotiate that arrangement with? Is it either like Fatah or Hamas? And it's not about the fact that like it's difficult to arrange. It's about the fact that it's always an out for people to justify why the peace arrangement is not going to be reached. Because someone from Israel, even if it's the case that there is a lot of population like pressure for you to try to create some kind of peace, will just point to the fact that you don't exactly know who are you supposed to negotiate with. Therefore, it's not viable at the moment. Internally within Israel, you have to first then agree on who ought to represent the state of Israel to the negotiation table. If it's the case that that is absent, then the discussion is first who ought to be representing Palestine, as opposed to actually whether it's the case that like this arrangement is viable. Then there has to be stable population buy-in. It's not just about people being tired from war. It's about the fact that people can commit to the vision of eventual peace. I don't think they can do that because the conflict is still fresh in their mind and it runs recurrently every time someone shoots a rocket over the border, right? So at this point of time, Israel, like it's in the conception of the Israelis that the moment Hamas or any other, if it's the case that anyone else takes control of the Judea and Samaria hills, rockets can potentially fall upon Jerusalem, and that's a bad thing. And I also want you to note about like how people conceptualize national security concerns, because it's not about if I'm tired enough, I don't have to do it. If it's the case that I have no one to foresee as a threat, I can potentially opt out. Like every country in the world, even if it's the case that they do not have a visible threat, also maintains national security, also have a standing army. Because the point of ensuring safety is to be preemptive, to make sure that no one else can do things to hurt you, as opposed to just like trust that does not happen, which is why like they also maintain like intelligence network. So insofar as there's reasonable fear that the other side can attack you, and this is in fact reasonable fear because it's been backed by history, I don't think it's the case that the population, even if they have an incentive towards peace, commit to that peace. Lastly, I just don't think you can control the dissenters that well. And here's the crucial weighing that I think makes us very different from opening. So like closing government, you just have to address this. Like, it is important for you to prove that those who want the solution have a means to control those who dissent, to a larger capacity than those who dissent have a capacity to derail the process. So, for example, assassinating the person who's trying to make the peace deal happen is a terrific way to derail that process. And if it's the case that we can identify to you those are people who are likely to be able to do so, who have an incentive to do so, we can indeed prove to you that this will not happen. So it looks like, for example, Israeli politicians telling their own population that they do not know who to negotiate with, the Palestinian leadership telling other people that we don't have a representative at the moment, like religious leaders telling you that it's not clear who ought to own Jerusalem and we cannot give up on that because of religious tenets, etc. What that means is, even if it's the case, at this point, I have flagged out, yes, there are incentives for people to move towards peace. That is not the same thing as proving that peace will happen. The way in which they try to override this is to prove scale. So the incentives are so big, it applies to so many people. Surely at some point, eventually there will be peace. I have two contention. The first is, I don't think saying that people prefer peace or have an incentive towards peace is the same thing as proving that people have a commitment towards peace. Because think about how that process would happen. And again, Litwood talks about the process, right? If it's the case that an Israeli politician maybe wants to lean towards peace, is he willing to commit to that process? Can he tell Israelis that they should stand down in order for the two-state solution to happen? And at the point by which a rocket does hit Jerusalem, can he take the political hit? Can he take the backlash of the fact that the population will point to him and say that you made this happen because you did not protect us? So maybe he has an incentive, but he doesn't have the commitment. On their side of the house, they have to prove the commitment, they did not do so. The second is about timely consensus. So it's not just about generally people have an incentive, it's about the fact that they can all align together, because at some point, support for the two-state solution has been high in Israel. At some point, the support for the two-state solution has been high in Palestine. But do these things coincide? And even if it's like they coincide, they have to coincide in a way in which like the dissenters don't derail the process. All of these things are absent, which is why the case does not work. Before I go, I'll take one from opening.
Yeah, to clarify your question, we know Hamas has been a part of existing negotiations because they agreed to release the hostages held by Hamas. They are obviously a part of negotiations along with a number of other multilateral organizations. Why will they not then want to develop a comprehensive plan, one in which they all consent to?
Because they do not want Israel to also negotiate with Fatah because they are in competition with those parties as well. It's just complex. So the way in which they want to try to override the case now is that there is external pressure that is so large for peace that it will eventually materialize. This offering coming up from opening government, but at the same time they say that Israel have other things to be concerned about, therefore they will not focus on the war with Palestine. But the rest of the world also has that, and if it's the case that you have to weigh up whether Israel cares more about Palestine or the rest of the world cares more about Palestine, if Israel is willing to look the other way in accordance to OG, I think the rest of the world won't commit to this two-state solution to the extent in which they claim it to be. So the last thing that we have now is just the claim from closing government that this will eventually work. But internal war is probable, right? Like, there's no feasible way for North and South Korea to actually unify. Like, the internal civil war in Myanmar has been ongoing since independence. The Turks and the Kurds have no way forward for peace. So yes, it is true that I think it's fair. It's not the case that the arc of history will bend towards peace. If it's the case that perpetually things are going to be difficult, then they will just remain as such. Like, they claim equilibrium. We think there's just sufficient fluctuation to make it so that peace is non-viable.
Thanks for that speech, and everybody for what was a great final. Teams can cross the floor over and go back to the main hall. Judges, can you please move to...
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Let's